Good afternoon. Welcome to this month's installment of Creation Justice webinars. This is the webinar where we create a space for us to talk and to discuss and to discern together how we can best put our faith into action on behalf of our common home. I'm Brooks Barron. I'm the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. Normally, I'm joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm. Michael is off planting and watering the seeds of justice. He's in flight to Texas right now, and so it'll be me flying solo on this webinar today. Grateful to be joined by a couple of outstanding guests and panelists today. Before I introduce them, let me say a few words to frame our conversation for today. Often when we talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of going solar or doing energy efficiency upgrades, it's really wise to point out how this is a way to do well by doing good. It's a way to do financial and environmental stewardship at the same time. All of that is important to highlight and to be mindful of when we address these topics. Today, I want us to take it even a step further back to think about how we got to this webinar and this topic of focusing on the Inflation Reduction Act as part of our going solar, as part of energy efficiency. And here I'm reminded of something that was once said by Vincent Harding, who was a participant in the civil rights movement and who was a historian of the civil rights movement, very well known as the author of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous anti-Vietnam War address at Riverside Church in New York City. And something that Vincent Harding once said is that democracy is not a static thing. It does not stand still. If we don't find ways to expand and deepen democracy, we'll see it diminish. And I mention that today because we are at where we are at right now because of the ongoing struggle of people who want to see their values put into action through government legislation. They wanted to see clean energy supported by our government. And so we have these opportunities now because of an ongoing struggle, and that struggle's not over yet. And so I want you to think about how we got to this place today and to be mindful of the work that continues. And in what we're talking about today, it's really about the work that needs to happen in local communities throughout the country. For the Inflation Reduction Act to reach its fullest potential, it needs each of us in our local communities to seize hold of the opportunities that it's presenting before us. And so with that said, let me introduce our terrific panelists for today. We are fortunate to really have the right people at the right moment for this webinar. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. Up first, we'll have Rebecca Perera, who is the Director of Lending for the United Church of Christ Cornerstone Fund. We're happy to work with the Cornerstone Fund in collaborating and putting together this webinar. They have been a long advocate for climate care church energy projects. For Rebecca, before coming to the Cornerstone Fund, she worked for the Economic and Community Development Institute, a nonprofit microlender. Recently, she received a certificate in commercial solar lending through a program sponsored by the Department of Energy at the University of New Hampshire's Carsey School of Public Policy. We'll then have Jerome Garciano, who is an attorney for the Polsinelli firm in Boston. He has extensive experience in providing support to nonprofits and navigating state and federal tax incentives related to our built environment. He is a LEED accredited professional, has been advising clients on utilizing energy efficiency and renewable energy tax incentives. He also works on tax policy initiatives promoting green energy and real estate development. He is the author of the Green Tax Incentive Compendium. We are fortunate to have both of these speakers and panelists with us today. Rebecca, if you could get us started, that would be wonderful.
Thanks so much, Brooks, and we're so excited to be included on this webinar. As you can hear, I'm getting over a cold, so apologies to all for my croaky voice. The Cornerstone Fund, as you know, and as you mentioned, has long been an advocate for climate justice and climate and creation care projects in churches. We have funded solar projects, and we stand ready to fund all solar projects, and have been doing it for a long time. But through doing it, we've seen how complicated it can be for churches. And part of the purpose in doing this webinar is to clear up some of that, and also to express our deep excitement about the IRA and what it means for churches. So let me share my screen. Let me get over here and make sure I've got the right one. Okay, so solar basics, components of a solar project. The reason that we're starting here, and this might be a review for many of our viewers, we need to set the stage for why the IRA is so important. Jerome will get into those details shortly, but just so that everybody is on the same page here, it's important that we sort of go over how solar is, how it's come to be, how it is, and what it works, how it works right now as it exists. Let's second. So you might notice, if you've ever looked into any kind of solar, that there's a real alphabet soup involved. There are many acronyms, and solar people will throw these around as if everybody knows what they mean, and we generally don't. So we're going to go through this quickly. I don't want to get hung up on this, but just so that people have a basic understanding of where the terms that are used. The investment tax credit is the big one. That's what we're really talking about today. That's what the IRA really is all about in terms of helping churches. The investment tax credit is a straight up tax credit that entities and individuals can get for investing in solar and other energy projects, but primarily solar. And it comes as a tax credit, meaning that whatever you owe in taxes, you'll get a credit back for a chunk of what you spent on solar. This hasn't been useful to churches because churches don't pay taxes. Churches don't have a tax liability. So we've been kind of left out of this. Renewable energy credits. These are the RECs, the RECs, the SRECs, the TRECs, things that you hear talked about like that. Is another thing that can be part of the funding in a solar project. It's very variable state by state. We'll get into some of that later. But whenever you see that REC or hear REC talked about, we're talking about renewable energy credits. It's separate than the tax credit. A church can get a renewable energy credit. It has nothing to do with taxes. It's something that comes directly from the state, different from the investment tax credit. But both of those two things together form really important components of most solar projects. PPA, that's another one we hear a lot, the power purchase agreement. That is a sort of an alternative to buying your system, where instead of, you might have rooftop solar, you might not own that solar, but you're buying the power that comes from that. And that is captured in a document called the power purchase agreement. And it's an agreement to buy the solar that's coming from your own project. PIS, placed in service, also very important for the IRA and for tax credits in general. There are all kinds of steps in getting a solar project organized. The date that the system is placed in service is the one that the IRS wants to know about. It's a little bit different than when it's actually placed into operation, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. O&M, operation and maintenance, the systems need to be maintained. So there's generally something called an O&M contract for a solar installation. Net metering, very, very important. Net metering is available in all states now in some form or other. And what that means is if you have solar on your house and you feed excess solar into the grid on a sunny day, you get credit for that. So on a cloudy day, when you're not producing as much, you get credit for that electricity that you banked earlier on a sunny day. The terms of net metering are very different from state to state. And a lot of times this can be really the crucial thing that makes a solar project work, is how generous your state's net metering arrangement is. The off-taker, this is another term that gets used a lot. The off-taker is whoever is using the electricity. Not sure how that one came to be, but that's the term that all the solar people use for who actually uses the electricity in the end. And then community solar, another term you'll hear a lot more of after the IRA. Not all states allow it yet, but it is an arrangement by which a host, a church, for example, could build a very large solar system that more than meets its needs and sell the excess to a group of their choosing or to a group as allowed by the state regulators. For example, it's very common to have a community solar project where the host uses half of the electricity and the remaining 50% is mandated to be sold to LMI households within the county, for example. So that's another thing that has a lot of potential for churches. So anyway, to oversimplify solar projects, basically it boils down to this. There are two main players when it comes to a solar project. There's the developer who's going to build it, and then there's the site host who wants it built, the church. And that is who owns the land, who owns the building. And the big question that determines what happens next is who gets to own the solar system once it's built. And the reason that that is even a question has to do with the tax credits. It boils down to who can use the tax credits that are going to get that essentially 30% discount somewhere into this deal. Churches just can't use them because they don't have any kind of taxes that they need to pay. So it doesn't do them any good. For-profit companies and wealthy individuals who have lots of tax liability, and by that I mean they are going to owe a lot of tax at the end of the year and they want to find a way to offset that. So if you think of a company with tremendous profits, or you think of an individual who's sold a bunch of stocks and has some capital gains tax to offset, those people really are looking for ways to shelter themselves from taxes. That doesn't apply to most normal households or to churches. In most normal households don't have a huge amount of tax liability, some, and it certainly can help, but churches really don't have any. But because most solar, all financing that kind of is built up around solar, the way the market has developed a solar project to work, you really need that 30% discount in there. The market depends on it to price your system into something close to feasibility. So that's why a lot of the more complex structures that we see in solar have evolved. It's not that common to find a church that just straight out buys a solar system, puts it on its roof, or a household. More often you will see the market's solution to this, which is leases and PPAs, most commonly PPAs. So there you have your solar installer, the development company, who either itself has tax liability it needs to offset, or is connected with a tax equity investor who's a part owner, or has an ability to sell these tax credits to somebody. They can use them. So they own the system. They put the system on my church or my house, but they own it. And I, as the off-taker, cannot own it. I can use the electricity that comes from it. My numbers look the same as if it was a for-profit company. I'm still getting cheap electricity. I'm getting clean electricity, but I can't own the system. It just can't happen under the current arrangement. So this is unsatisfactory for a bunch of reasons. I mean, many churches, I can tell you from experience working at the Cornerstone Fund, like to own things. They generally own their buildings free and clear, except for brief periods where they'll have a Cornerstone mortgage for improvements. And they like to keep it that way. They would much rather own the system, but sometimes it just isn't feasible. PPAs and leases are not necessarily bad by any stretch. Same as leasing a car or renting an apartment rather than owning a home. In many situations, it makes perfect sense. And there's a lot of advantages. There are many for-profit companies that will choose to enter into a PPA. Then they don't have to worry about maintenance. They don't have to worry about replacing anything. They don't have, I mean, it's a very turnkey and easy way of getting solar without any of the stress of it. But there are many other businesses that prefer to own the system outright and reap all the financial benefits that they can from it. So the issue really is that nonprofits are in a situation where they're not treated the same as everyone else. They can't buy at the same price as everybody else. adding into it the recs. Let's get back to the state recs. About 29 states have some type of rec. Not all of them do. They tend to be concentrated in New England, Texas, the West. The Southeast and Midwest tend to not really have rec markets, but in places where there are rec markets, they can be very lucrative. DC right now, the rec market is very high, Massachusetts, New Jersey. And this has to do with states that have basically mandated that their utilities get a certain percentage of their power from solar. And when those mandates are high and they are not producing that much solar themselves, they need to go buy energy credits from somebody who is producing solar. So if you're a church and you're producing a bunch of solar, you can sell your RECs in Washington, DC for something like $400 a piece right now every year. And that's a lot of money. So and it's not just utilities that buy them, it's also companies with a need to, like, for example, the Cornerstone Fund, we could say, we really believe, Maria Coyne, that we should be a carbon neutral workplace and we can't put solar on our giant office building, but what can you do? Maybe she could go buy some RECs and offset our electricity usage. So there are a lot of ways that the REC market is potentially going to be a big help to making some solar projects go. Not in every state, but the RECs only flow to the owner of the system. So if the church has had to enter into a PPA or a lease just because it was unaffordable to pay that 30% premium to own, they miss out on this REC market as well. So again, not every state, but when it's there, it's something you'd really rather not miss. Other quick terms, I just wanted to make sure I got to these. I think I've talked about all of these at the beginning. But net metering actually can be really, really super important to whether your project is feasible or not, depending on what your state does. Placed in service, not the same thing as PTO, which is permission to operate. And I can say quickly how this came to be. Because the tax credits have to be in the year that the system was placed in service, there had to be a real definition break between placed in service and permission to operate, because everybody who's been through a construction project knows it's unpredictable and there's a lot of push to get things done by the end of the year to get the IRS tax credits. But what if your utility company is really backed up and they can't come out and inspect the system and give you permission to operate until January? So that's why this definition was kind of split. So placed in service is the key here. So if you are in the middle right now of building a solar project and it is not placed in service until 2023, you get everything that comes with this IRA, which is a really good thing. And it's actually retroactive to 22, I'm pretty sure in many cases. So Jerome will talk about that. So it's a really good time for churches to do solar. All right, so that's the quick overview, setting the stage for why things are how they are. And I will say, as a lender, having talked to many churches that would like to do solar, the churches that tend to actually be able to do it are ones that have a congregation member who happens to be a scientist or has already put solar on his or her house and is ready to do all the footwork of plowing through all the agreements, trying to understand the state incentives, all the things that have to go into it. And it's really overwhelming. And our goal here is to simplify the process and be available to churches as a resource so we can assist with that process and thereby make it much easier for churches to go ahead and take advantage of this amazing IRA direct pay tax credit, which now Jerome will talk about. Let me stop sharing here. I'm trying to find oh, here it is. The stop share is over here. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah. Thanks everybody for inviting me to this panel. Again, Jerome Garciano, I'm an attorney at Polsinelli. I sit in the firm's tax credit finance department, so I've been doing tax credit projects in housing and economic development, other types of energy projects for many years now. And yeah, this changes in the IRA, as Rebecca and Brooks were saying, is very exciting. So I'm happy to walk you through some of that. Let me share my screen now. Okay. So we were under an existing regime of energy tax credits. Rebecca mentioned the investment tax credit. There's also a production tax credit. And I think most of you probably know that we were having a lot of these benefits reduced over the recent years until the legislation changed. So in theory, we were actually looking at a regime where we had a step down of the energy tax credits down to, eventually 10% if we did not have this Inflation Reduction Act that passed. And I, early this year did not think it was going to pass. It was very surprising, obviously a good surprise, but just really night and day in terms of, I think, where we were before and kind of the outlook, and then kind of what we have now. So I'm not going to talk about all of these. I am going to focus on the investment tax credit, which is Section 48. But just so you know, a lot of the changes, the act was very comprehensive in terms of a lot of energy policy, from energy efficiency to electric vehicles, battery storage, microgrids. There was just a ton of things there. New technologies, new technology neutral regime that's coming up. So one thing to note is, so technically the investment tax credit, which is the, we would normally just refer to as a solar tax credit. The current program is technically only available till 2025. But at that point, there is a new section in the code that will take over, essentially. It'll basically do the same thing. So, but we essentially have a system and regime up for the next 10 years. And so we're hoping that, this would really, the stability of this and just the generosity of some of these bonuses and incentives that I'll go through will hopefully put us on the right direction in terms of renewable energy and reducing greenhouse gas. So I know that there were some comments already coming in as I'm kind of looking at them about energy efficiency. So we're not going to talk about that today, but there's certainly a lot of changes and benefits around, for at least for commercial buildings, energy efficiency, as well as things like electric vehicles, as I mentioned. So the investment tax credit is Section 48 of the Internal Revenue Code. As Rebecca mentioned, it's a tax credit, and you get a dollar for dollar reduction in your tax liability if you qualify for this tax credit. And so, the developers that Rebecca mentioned, oftentimes, and usually when a project is large enough, would create a partnership between an entity that actually can utilize the tax credit, let's say like a big bank or insurance company, and the developer. And so you would have these partnerships that would own the solar projects, and the investor, let's say the bank or the insurance company, in exchange for the credits, would provide capital to finance the project. So, let's say for an example, kind of very basic example, an investor might pay, let's say, 90 cents on the dollar for a tax credit, and then received, that the difference between the dollar amount and the 90 cents as a return on their investment. There are most of the time, actually, that number is north of $1 because there are other tax benefits like depreciation, and there might be other economics that would impact the investor's return and the amount of capital that they're willing to build. But essentially, that's how the investment tax credit works. Is there's a tax credit, it somehow gets monetized, and the funds used through that monetization is used to build the project. So the big changes through the IRA on Section 48 is setting the tax credit amount at a base level. Technically, the base level is 6%, but for prevailing wage projects and smaller projects, that base rate is 30%. So again, we were in a regime where the tax credit percent was going down. Now, for most of the projects, and for all intents and purposes, projects that are probably this audience is concerned with, we are at 30% now. So essentially, that means 30% of the costs, generally of a solar project could be used to would generate a tax credit in the amount that can be again used to monetize, finance the project. So $1 million project, $300,000 of tax credits, and so you'd be able to use those tax credits to finance, part of that project. Some other really important changes to the credit include bonus credits, and so in addition to the 30%, you can actually go up to 40% if the panels and the steel components of the energy system is made in the United States. I believe it's the United States. So domestic content. So essentially, for equipment made in the United States, you could increase that tax credit amount to 40%. Additionally, if your project is located in an energy community, which is defined as a brownfield site, which wouldn't apply in this case, but there's also other low-income areas that are particularly tied to fossil fuel communities and fossil fuel shutdowns. So in those areas that have kind of high unemployment, low income populations, there is another bonus of 10%. So that is a new element of the IRA. Probably most exciting is this next point. So it's labeled the Environmental Justice Solar and Wind bonus, and so this only applies to solar and wind projects, and you can get another 10% or another 20% if you qualify for this bonus. The difference about this bonus is that the IRS is mandated to create a allocation process for this bonus, and so there's only a set amount of this bonus. I think it's like 1.8 gigawatts per year for the country. So there is going to be some regulations that will need to come out. We're hoping that these regulations will be coming out this year, or not, beginning of next year. Let's say February, to be able to highlight like how that process, procedure is gonna happen. But if you're in a low income community, 10%, and that there's certain specific definitions with regards to census tracts, and there is another tax credit called the New Markets Tax Credit that qualifies businesses and property in low-income communities with certain poverty levels. So that definition is actually tied to the New Markets Tax Credit definition, but that's an additional 10% bonus. And then if your project is on a low-income housing building or an economic benefit project that benefits low-income residents or neighbors, that is an additional 20% bonus. So theoretically, if you had all the bonuses, the maximum amount of bonus, you would start with a 30% credit. You can add 10% if you had the domestic content, and then you'll be up to 50% if you were also, let's say, in a low energy community, let's say a low income census tract that's been affected by fossil fuel shutdown. And then if you did, let's say, maybe like a community solar project, like Rebecca mentioned, that shared power with, let's say, low income neighbors, theoretically, then you would be up to 70% if I'm doing my math right. So, I mean, that's just the fact that there could be theoretically be a 70% credit is just very amazing. And again, we were looking at a regime where we were stepping down eventually to 10%, but now to say that we could theoretically get 70% credit is quite remarkable. Just another note, I think somebody did mention in the chat about storage. So the changes to the credits now specifically include standalone storage. And so before there was a question about whether batteries would be included or not, depending on kind of how it's set up, et cetera. But I think it's a lot clearer now that batteries, microgrid controllers, other interconnection related properties are included to qualify for the credits. The cost of those would qualify for the credits. Just quickly, this slide shows the new regimes, the new programs that will be coming online in 2025. So the replacement for the ITC would be called, this first one, the 48E. So we probably refer to that as 48 Cap E, and that's called the Clean Electricity Investment Credit. So still an investment credit, but the new regime is actually technology neutral and is really tied to greenhouse gas emissions. So these are some of the new credits that will be that have been enacted, and some of them will be coming online in a couple of years. Probably most relevant for today's audience are the first election here listed in section 6417. And I'll talk a little bit more about that for tax exempt organizations. There's also another election, 6418, that's available for regular taxpayers, taxable organizations, where you can actually transfer a credit to an unrelated taxpayer without using an ownership partnership structure. But again, I think today's most important slide is in front of you now, this election for payment against income tax. So essentially, if you are an applicable entity, which includes any organization exempt from income tax, which is subtitle A, so 501c3s, other nonprofits, churches, even though they might not technically have applied for a 501c3 status, would be included in this. Also included are government agencies, Indian tribes. But essentially, if you are an entity that doesn't pay taxes, Rebecca referred to earlier, you can actually benefit from the credit by making this election. And essentially, if you make this election, the IRS is treating you as having paid a tax in the amount of the credit. And so subsequently, you would get a refund. So just like, if you do withholding on your income taxes, on your tax forms, if you're withholding extra, when your return comes back, you get that return to you, right? And so it will essentially same function. And so they're using, again, the tax administration process, right? The tax return and tax filing process to document this. The payment will actually be treated as a payment, either the due date of the return or with the date of the actual return. And this election won't start to actually be in place until probably after the regulations are in place. Technically, there's a 180-day period that we'll start to kind of work on, setting up this process that the tax exempt organizations need to wait for in order to actually start utilizing this. But February is not that far away. And so, I think this is a game changer in terms of, how nonprofits, not only churches, but schools, hospitals, other nonprofits that might own real estate or might want to develop a solar project. Again, they at this point would not need to create a tax credit partnership structure or admit a third party investor to be able to monetize that tax credit. They can actually just make the selection, and when the return happens, and the payment of that refund would essentially be cash to the nonprofit. There is a question about timing. So certainly many nonprofits might not have the cash to be able to build the project up front, to be able to qualify for the selection on the back end. So I would imagine that there would be a new set of partners, a new set of lenders popping up to be able to monetize, not monetize, to be able to bridge that. And certainly, maybe Cornerstone and some others might try to figure out a system to be able to do that. But there might be an 18-month difference in terms of when you would need the funds to actually build a project to when that cash actually comes back from the return. So you need to consider the timing of the funds. We need to make sure to avoid excessive payments. I mean, certainly you don't want to be claiming a payment for more than what the tax credits you would actually receive in kind of a normal circumstances. So you would get penalized for that. You would be kind of financially on the hook for any fraud, but any even kind of miscalculation of the tax credit amount. So I think that nonprofits need to be sure that they work with good record keeping, good professionals, teams that know how to document this and make sure that they know exactly what costs are allowable to be able to calculate the 30%. And so you need to keep in mind, again, there is a penalty for excessive payment. Technical piece that, there's no tax exempt use restriction in other credits and the solar credit in prior iterations actually restricted nonprofits, tax exempts from actually using properties that qualified for other credits. There's a specific carve out now for this program, obviously, because the government Congress has allowed this election. So I will stop there. I guess hand it back to Brooks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jerome and Rebecca. I think just first up, it might be helpful for those of us, I'm kind of myself in this, that are new to this kind of language and these kind of concepts, to give kind of a synopsis or a summary. So let's say that next week I've been asked to present to my church council, and they've heard I've attended this webinar that's all about the benefits of the IRA, and they want to know what can we get out of this. How maybe if Jerome first take a stab at this of how I would summarize that. Am I correct in saying that if we're interested in going solar, we would get at least 30% in a direct payment, right? And then there's maybe some potentials for other adding to that 30%, but we're talking about at least 30% of a direct payment for the cost of the solar. So that's part one of the comment I would want to make to a council at a church council meeting. And then part two would be, I realized you weren't going to get too much into this, but if you could just kind of give us a little bit of a sense, if a church is interested in kind of energy efficiency related things, like new windows, new appliances, is there something in there for churches, and does it come through direct payment, or is it something that comes to the person doing the work and we benefit because they're getting a benefit? Like, can you explain? So I could just put that in real simple language for my church council. Could you maybe Jerome take a first stab at?
Yeah, I think your summary on the solar pieces, I think is spot on, and certainly Rebecca and Cornerstone could provide some other maybe tools to help churches execute on that. But essentially, 30% up to potentially 70% of the costs can now be covered in terms of the solar project, and now there is this election to have a direct payment through the tax filing and tax return system, and so nonprofits and churches don't need to enter into, kind of large tax partnerships with other unrelated entities to be able to monetize the credits. In terms of energy efficiency, I think it depends on kind of whether, what buildings you're talking about. There's certainly, some nonprofit, faith-based nonprofits and churches that do housing. There are certainly other housing related energy efficiency incentives. There's a 45L credit, which is for net zero ready homes, up to $5,000 a unit, and a tax credit that you would be able to monetize. There's also a 179D, a tax deduction. So that's not a tax credit, but a tax deduction, where nonprofits it's a little different because it's not a tax credit that can be, transferred like what we're talking about here with this election, but the tax deduction can actually be allocated by the nonprofit to the designer of the property, the energy efficient property. So that theoretically could be a bonus for, either reducing the cost of that or somehow, getting credit for that incentive. And so, another really exciting thing that, personally would be if churches could get into electric vehicle charging stations. There's tax credits for charging stations. There's tax credits for electric vehicles themselves, for not just for personal use, but also for commercial use. And theoretically, there might be some type of structure, that car sharing program. Imagine that, like some type of way to kind of leverage kind of the community aspect of kind of a church. But there are a lot of church parking lots out there, and so I think that would be kind of a good potential to think about some electric vehicle infrastructure.
All right, thank you. Rebecca, we've got some questions here pertaining to the Cornerstone Fund. Is the IRA, impact interest rates as a one question? Kind of what are the current rates that you're offering? Do you want to tackle some of that for people?
Yeah, sure. I saw some of those questions. Yeah, so we at Cornerstone, the interest rates are unrelated to the IRA. It doesn't really incentivize us as a lender. However, we are very committed to creation care, and we already have a creation care loan fund at a reduced rate. So we can lend up to $100,000 at 3.5% for 3 years to fund energy projects and creation care projects. We've done a lot of that. That's thanks to many of our investors who have chosen to invest in this creation care fund. So if you're one of them, thank you so much. You make it possible for many churches to take advantage of this. If we're going above $100,000, then we would be looking at our normal Cornerstone loan funds. Right now, that rate is 5.25%. We are in a rising rate environment, so the sooner the better. But we do everything that we can at the Cornerstone Fund to make your project work. And sometimes that means longer terms. Rates are just one little piece of the puzzle that we are able to work with to make your project happen.
Right. Another question we have is about the 30% benefit. Is that a one-time benefit? Are there cash benefits that are longer than 1 year?
Yeah, so the tax credits, like the investment tax credit, is 30% is a one-time benefit. You get that the first year, and so that would just be kind of a one and done. And obviously it's a larger percentage of the project cost, and that all accrues on that first year. There are some non-tax credit related incentives. I think Rebecca mentioned the RECs that can be taken over time, but for the tax credits, for the ITC, it's a 1-year credit.
Right. And then another question: am I right in understanding that the money has to be first spent on a system before applying the 30% or more direct payment?
That is exactly, and I'm so glad that somebody asked that question. Yes, that is really important. You have to build your system, then you get the rebate. And that's where a good lender can come in really handy, and somebody who understands how that's going to work. and is really committed to making sure that you get your project done. Yeah, you cannot claim the tax credit until your project is PIS, placed in service, which means it has to be capable of connecting to the grid or capable of functioning in some way. And to get to that point, you've got to pay for it. So yes, that's why, and we've worked on many solar projects where we've deferred payments pending rebates coming in, pending recs coming in. We will work to structure whatever you need to make your project work.
Right.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mentioned the timing earlier. I mean, I think that's a critical factor. And so having a good lender, like Cornerstone, to figure out, okay, the project, let's say, costs $1 million. Can we actually fund that upfront and have repayment over time, including, let's say, a big slug 18 months later when the return actually comes in, right? So let's say if you place in service in January of 23, or anytime in 23, your tax return aren't, let's say, theoretically due till May of the following year. So there's going to be some months there where you're going to be waiting for that payment. So you're going to need a lender to bridge that. And yeah, just considering the timing, is going to be really important. And one thing is that a lot of these mechanics, I think, are going to get clarified, with the new regulations. So like right now, and everybody's waiting for the regulations from the IRS. So we have statutes right now, but they've been promised, February next year. Maybe we'll see them sooner, who knows? But once those details come out, I think there'll be a lot more comfort and a lot more details to be able to kind of build around, like, how is this going to actually work in terms of the mechanics. So just wanted to note that.
Right. Jerome, this may have already been covered or implied in some of your earlier comments, but but I want to make sure we get this solid for people that are asking about it, which is there something in the RA that applies for HVACs and heat pumps that is in there for, reachable for faith communities?
So, I mean, I think it's again going to depend on the definition of, what building that those are going to go into. For HVAC and heat pumps for personal residences, there are certainly, kind of revamped and renewed tax credits. For commercial property or other, non-personal residence property, I think it's just going to depend on kind of what type of building it is and kind of what system it is. The tax deduction, that I mentioned, does include measures that reduce the consumption of energy. And so, if you're below a certain benchmark, it's going to qualify for these tax benefits. So that's 179 Cap D. And again, there are some energy efficiency provisions that apply to residential homes in terms of like multifamily projects or other kind of rental projects. And so, we'd have to look maybe a little more deeply on again what type of building. And I'm imagining people are thinking about like, standard sanctuary buildings. But we need to look into that in terms of where they might classify in terms of what type of building it is and how they would be categorized.
Okay, is there like a resource? So it seems like that more investigation and to figuring out kind of applicability is needed for a church or synagogue to figure that one out for their kind of worship structure. Is there kind of a resource we can point people to kind of investigate and figure that out?
So I don't know, Rebecca, if your group, if Cornerstone does, any type of work, I know you do a lot of, equipment loans and other kind of improvements. Certainly happy to share, Brooks, the Green Tax Incentive Compendium that you mentioned earlier. That is a 50-state survey, both federal credits and state credits. So the one thing I forgot to mention was that there are actually state credits for, sometimes for energy, but oftentimes for energy efficiency. There's some states that do incentives for like LEED certified buildings or LEED qualifying buildings. So happy to share that as a resource, Brooke. So if there's a way to get that out to people, I'm happy to share that. And I don't know, Rebecca, if there's other resources that you can point to.
Well, I will say that there's a lot that we don't fully understand about the mechanics of the bill yet, as Jerome has mentioned. The IRS did just send out a request for comments on 3 broad areas. Cornerstone is planning to comment, and the basis, your questions here will form the basis of our comment. We are here to ask questions for churches, so we will be pushing that and doing our best to get that information back out to you. In the meantime, I think SEIA, SEIA, it's a solar organization that's very reliable with information. So that's a good website to check out and keep an eye on as things progress.
And Rebecca, I don't probably need to say this for you, but people should know that you're not just servicing, providing services for UCC churches. Do you want to say more about that?
Sure. Thank you, Brooks. No, the Cornerstone Fund lends to UCC churches and related nonprofits, and we do lend outside the denomination as well. There's a process that we have, and we would welcome applications from everybody. If you're a church or you're a nonprofit, we'd be more than happy to talk to you, especially about creation care.
Right. Jerome, if you could tell us a little bit more about your compendium. Is it really only of use for people that are dealing in the realm of taxes, or is it of use for nonprofits and faith communities? Like if I'm looking at, the state of Ohio, like, am I going to look in there and be like, oh, this will apply to my church?
So, yeah, I mean, I think it mainly covers credits that are going to be available for, for-profit or tax-paying entities. Again, except for this huge, new change now at the federal level for certain credits. So this election, the 6417 only applies to certain tax credits, but obviously solar is being probably the most important that we're talking about today. So yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your interest. It's certainly a very dense, let's call it, piece. It's meant to be a reference guide. It has like a little chart by state on what incentives are available, what technologies they cover. And if you are an individual just maybe looking for what incentives can I access even just for doing improvements on my house, I mean, I think it is useful for that. For nonprofits, again, depending on the credit, depending on the technology, it could be useful for that, but I think it depends on structuring and how you might need to partner with others. So again, before the election, nonprofits still could have accessed some of these programs, right? But then it just would be a lot more complicated. There would be some other partners you'd need to bring into the ownership structure and other entity structuring issues that you need to work through. And so, yeah, I think the compendium gives a good overview of what's available, and it details again whether a nonprofit could apply for this or could benefit from it.
Jerome, if you could help also understand kind of the part about things that are classified as environmental justice areas, I believe, and that being related to it. I thought I saw an article that they're really estimated that there are really broad swaths of the country that according to how things are defined in the legislation, could be considered part of these environmental justice areas. Am I wrong or off base, or is there something we should know about how applicable that can be?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple credits that have this geographic, analysis that would need to happen, like where exactly are you located? What census tract are you in? So you were mentioning the environmental justice solar bonus, right? So that's where you can get either a 10% bonus or a 20% bonus. So the 10% bonus is if you are in a low income community. So usually there are definitions around like census tracts. So I think technically this definition is a census tract with a poverty rate of at least 20%. And so, but they also reference, this a new markets tax credit statute. So there are defined census tracts, and I'm not exactly sure what federal agency would in charge of it, whether it be part of Treasury that would define that, or if it's a HUD standard. But essentially, there are maps online that you could look up and say, new markets tax credit eligible census tract, or some low income census tract like lookup. And there are firms and other tools online that where you can just type in your address, and then you could say, okay, am I in the low income census tract as defined by new markets tax credit? So that's very useful. But the 10% bonus is called the low income community bonus, and that is again the 20% poverty rate in that census tract, and also on Indian land as it's defined in the policy. So tribal land is also automatically a 10% bonus. The 20% bonus is if the energy system is on a residential rental building, which is essentially low-income housing. So there's a lot of low-income housing programs, different subsidies, federal and state, but probably the largest one is the low-income housing tax credit. And so if your project was on a low-income housing tax credit building, you would be eligible for this 20% increase. Again, for both of these, there's some type of application and allocation process. So, and again, you have to wait and see how that is structured and how that is set up. But in terms of the project, if you're on a low-income building, low-income residential rental building, you can qualify for the 20%. But what I was saying earlier about the community solar is if your project is a part of an economic benefit project where at least 50% of the financial benefits of the electricity produced is provided to households of an income of less than 200% of the poverty line, or 80% of the area median income, then you can also qualify for the 20%. So you don't have to be on a housing project to qualify for the 20%, but there's this other economic benefit standard where, let's say in a community solar project, if you're like selling electricity at a below market rate for benefiting these low income households, then that theoretically would qualify for the 20% bonus.
All right. Well, there's a lot of questions. I think the really important upshot though is we've got resources for people to go to, and Rebecca, I know you're there ready to kind of assist faith communities in much of this. And so I want to just, say that the webinar is wrapping up here, but there are possibilities to pursue. I'm always encouraging churches to think not just about their roofs, but what about having, covering your parking lot with some solar panels and then having that charge into cars. And so there could be a lot of ways that, that a church could take advantage of what is in this legislation. So thank you to both of you for this.